I'm delighted to welcome Catherine Eschle, who is Senior Lecturer in Politics at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. She's the author of Making Feminist Sense of the Global Justice Movement, which was one of her earlier books in 2010. She's also the author of Global Democracy, Social Movements, and Feminism, which is a book she brought out in 2018. And her article, Troubling Stories at the End of Occupy, Feminist Narratives of Betrayal at Occupy Glasgow, was awarded the 2019 Britta Baumgarten Memorial Prize for the best article published in the previous 2 years in the journal Social Movement Studies. And I can say, as the editor-in-chief of that journal, that we publish a lot of terrific articles, so the competition was extremely fierce for that prize, and Catherine won it. Her core area of interest lie in feminist theory and practice, particularly theoretical debates around democracy, intersectionality, solidarity, co-optation, and resistance. She works particularly in the empirical context of the UK, transnational activism, and also institutions of global governance. And she also works on the gender politics of and the role of feminism in social movements more generally, with a particular focus on anti-nuclear and anti-austerity organizing and protest camps. And she also is an expert in feminist methodology. And today she's going to talk about her latest book and more about feminism and protest camps. And without further ado, I give you Catherine Eschle.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. I'm really happy to see you today on such a beautiful sunny day here in Aarhus, and I'm very pleased to have this online audience as well. So I'd like to thank you all for coming. And I would also, of course, I like to express my heartfelt thanks to Christina for inviting me and hosting me so wonderfully. I would also like to thank Christina for in a more kind of fundamental way than that, actually, because her scholarship on collective identity, on collective organizing, on the movement of squares has actually been really influential on my own work, right back to the book on the global justice movement, but also in this more recent book on feminism and protest camps. And also because I'd like to thank Christina, because I am somebody whose disciplinary home, if you can call it that, is in politics and international relations. Hi, everybody, welcome. And most scholarship on protest camps for sure, but also lots of the scholarship I'm interested in is actually more in sociology, where social movement studies is located. And you know, my relationship to social movement studies is a bit attenuated, and Christina has always welcomed me warmly into that social movement studies space. So I'm very grateful to you for that as well. And in the spirit of well, I guess the feminist spirit of making invisible labor visible, I would also like to thank Natalia for organizing the logistics of my trip and getting me over here. So I'm going to talk about this book today, Feminism and Protest Camps, which I co-edited with Alison Bartlett, and which asks feminist questions about protest camps. And on this slide, you can see that you lucky people here and online can get a discount, quite a substantial discount, on what I recognize is a very expensive book. So really, this is more to persuade you to get your libraries to order it in, or you might be interested in that much cheaper e-book that's available. And if enough libraries order it, of course, we'll get a paperback. So this is part of the game we have to play. So yes, just to give you, I like people to know where I'm going, so you have a map of the talk. I am going to first talk about my personal and intellectual motivations for a feminist book on protest camps. Then I'm going to give you a whistle-stop overview of what is actually quite a large and complicated book. and hope to do it some justice. And then thirdly, I'm going to try to speak to the DEMINOVA theme of democratic imaginaries and innovation in social movements, and yeah, try and think how this book might help us think about that. So first part, what are protest camps and why a feminist book on them? So I think about protest camps as, or what are often referred to in the literature as encampments, as a kind of temporary home made by activists in spaces that are politically useful, symbolically resonant, or otherwise important to a community, in order to facilitate action for specific political ends, and also often, not always, but often to prefigure alternative ways of living. So what I'm particularly intrigued by is the combination of homemaking and of activism, and the fact that this is a spatially demarcated social movement tactic, which brings particular challenges as well as possibilities. And also that resistance to power or the struggle for change is often combined with the creation of alternative ways of living. As such, encampments can be spaces of quite radical democratic innovation, as well as an integral part of struggles to try and regenerate democratic institutions more broadly. And as we shall see, they are can also be sites of democratic anti-democratic marginalisation and also violence. So we're going to talk about both of those sides of protest camps. Hi, come in, welcome. It's great to see such an audience. I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm just letting people sit down here and get their breath before I carry on. So I've only just started. I've just defined what I'm talking about, and then I'll go into more detail. Okay. Yep. Right. So that's what protest camps are. So now I want to talk about, I guess, the more personal side of my motivation for writing about them. So this is a slide which shows pictures of Green and Common women's peace camp, some of them by the amazing documentary photographer Janine Weedle, who also took the photo that's on the cover of the book. So the book also opens with an excerpt from a diary of a woman arriving at Green and Common. So I'm hoping some of you know what Green and Common Peace Camp is. Not everybody, is a lot of shaking heads. Okay, so for those who don't know, Greenham was the earliest, largest and longest lasting of a whole series of women's peace camps that were set up across Europe, North America and Australia in the 1980s. Greenham was established in 1982. At its peak, it drew tens of thousands of women to protests outside the nuclear base, around which there was several camps actually around the perimeter of the nuclear base. And actually the last women didn't leave until the camp was returned to common land in 2000. So it's one of the most significant moments of feminist mobilisation in the UK for a long time. And I'm going to read to you briefly how Jane Campbell describes her arrival at the camp. So this is the excerpt with which the whole book opens. Like freshly sharpened pencils, red rings painted on sleek white, the ready-for-business missiles line up efficiently in their silos, while the women's peace camp sprawls in contrast the other side of the fence. New circles of tents bloom in colours onto the empty scrubland. But those who live permanently here, it is obvious, sleep under sheets of grubby plastic tarpaulin thrown over a pegged-down tree, which you can see an example of, I think, in that picture. Women have learned to live with only the amount of stuff that can be held in your arms during an eviction. Immediately, it feels as though I have wandered into an enchanted forest. So why I like that quote is because I think it's quite evocative of the you know, the very visceral contrast between the nuclear base on one side of the fence and the muddy, messy, sprawling women's peace camp on the other side of the fence. But more than that, I start with it because it helps situate my personal interest in camps. So I visited camps, I visited Greenham 2 or 3 times as a child with my mum, who was an occasional camper there. And that childhood visit has clearly stayed with me at quite a visceral level, because I remember it vividly, if very brokenly, and I've kind of retained this curiosity and interest in social movement politics generally, and in Greenham and in other protest camps more generally. I think it's fed into a growing feminist curiosity about the camps I've encountered as an adult, particularly a couple near my home in Glasgow in Scotland. So here on the right of the slide, is it right for you? Yeah, right for you, are some pictures of Faslane Peace Camp, which is claims to be the longest running peace camp in the world. It was set up just after Greenham, and it's still going in order to protest the housing of nuclear submarines on the Clyde. And Occupy Glasgow on the left of that slide there, which flared into brief and conflictual life when the worldwide Occupy movement touched down in Scotland in 2011. And it was striking to me as a sympathetic citizen visiting these camps, how they were very different experiences for the women in these spaces, how both camps had a very different relationship to feminism. And I started wondering about that. So I started a very small research project, a kind of retrospective one in 2014, investigating gender relations and the role of feminism in these 2 camps. And I found actually a relative silence or kind of gap in the literature on the kind of questions that I was interested in. So that's not to say there's nothing out there. There are these wonderful books which have been very important to me. So there is some really vibrant, rich literature on the women's peace camps of the 1980s, written from a feminist perspective, that are incredibly revealing, actually, about the activism at the time, often written from kind of insider perspectives. But what that literature doesn't do is reflect on the protest camp form. And then there's this other set of more recent literature, which comes out of social movement studies and also some kind of political philosophy writings on what's often called the global wave of protest camps that emerged around 2011 to 2014-15. People kind of date it slightly differently. But this global wave included the Occupy movement that I talked about earlier, and also some other protest camps. And yeah, so there's this very insightful, interesting literature on what protest camps mean and the protest camp form and its implications, but feminist voices are largely missing from that literature. Yeah, I became increasingly convinced that there was more to be said about protest camps from a collective feminist perspective. So this brings me to the more intellectual reasons for the book. Yeah, so protest camps, I think, are particularly fascinating from a feminist perspective because they bring domestic life into political protest, as these fairly random images of a whole range of encampments are intended to illustrate. In other words, then they disrupt the foundational division in liberal politics between public and private life. Moreover, campers often seek to develop and disseminate different models of domestic labor, one where the work is shared, where decisions are made collectively, where fewer resources are used and these are distributed more equally, where participants try to develop a kind of collective social life rather than retreating to private spaces and the nuclear family. Connectedly, protest camps merit feminist attention because they are spaces for gender politics. They have often been sites of transformation, quite radical transformation in how gender is lived and expressed, as evoked perhaps by the picture of Greenham on the left there. But they've also been sites of persistent gendered inequalities and even violence. And this picture on the right shows a banner that was put up in Occupy Glasgow after there was a gang rape there. And sadly, this was not a unique case in the Occupy movement, as one of our chapters attests. In the light of all of that, then it seems to me that a feminist study of protest camps is actually long overdue. And now finally it's here. So now I'm going to move on to the second part of my talk, which is a whistle-stop tour of this lovely new book, which I'm very proud of. I think it's got a very nice cover. It's a thing of beauty. Thank you. I'm just put up a quote on that slide from the back cover of the book, because it highlights how we collectively try and bridge the two literatures I mentioned earlier, between the feminist literature on the women's peace camps and the sociological and political studies literature on the global wave. So we try and cross those two literatures by looking also at case studies from both. And we also, it also evokes for me how the book is kind of Janus-based. It's trying to look at both how protest camps have gendered inequalities and violences, but also are sites of what we see as feminist possibility and mobilisation. And I want also to highlight the international breadth of the case studies that we cover. I mean, it's not perfect. There's lots of gaps. We tried to get other voices and other case studies, and this is what we managed, but I'm still proud of what we managed to do. Yes, you can see our case studies include not only Greenham and Occupy, but also the 15M movement in Spain, of which Christina has written extensively, and of a what the author calls a non-mixed camp that was established in Valencia for International Women's Day some years after 15M, and the author is Emma. Oh dear, sorry, I've got back on her name. Emma Gomez Nicolau tries to talk about the relationship and the disjunctures between 15M and this kind of non-mixed organizing. And that's it there, up there in the top left is one of her pictures. We also have a chapter on Turkey's Gezi Park protests in 2013. That's in the top right. And we have one on the Sunflower or 318 movement, which occupied the Taiwanese legislature in 2014. That's on the bottom left. And the final picture here is of the struggle of Indigenous Hawaiians, or Kanaka Maoli, against the 30-meter telescope project on the slopes of Mauna Kea, which is a sacred mountain for the Indigenous peoples of that place. And that's on the bottom right. We also have chapters on ecofeminist, anti-militarist and anti-globalization activism in the 90s and 2000s, and the ongoing landless movement in Brazil. Our authors are also quite an international bunch. This isn't actually all of them. I can't quite find pictures of everybody, but it is most of them. And moreover, they're drawn not just from, I'm not going to name them all here, but they're drawn not just from my discipline of politics and IR, but also from sociology, from literary, media and cultural studies, from lots of sociologists, from Indigenous studies, and from education. And we have a real diversity between us of methodology and style. It's one of the things I really enjoy about the book, actually, and certainly what I enjoyed about editing it, is that some of the contributions are written from the perspective of very deep personal involvement in the movements of which they write about, and are kind of written in a very reflective and intimate tone. While others take a deep dive into secondary sources or rely on, large-scale interviewing projects and are written in a more kind of social scientific manner. While yet others weave complex, fragmented narratives out of the biographies of particular activists or from their detective work in the archives. We also draw on very different feminist theoretical resources, from Judith Butler to Eileen Morton Robinson, and from Sylvia Federici to Veena Das. Some of those names might mean something to you, and many others besides. So there's a lot of diversity in the book, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that in the broadest terms, we share a common feminist approach, which is alive to the pervasive operations of gender, including within protest camps, and to its intersections with other forms of power and identity, and that is concerned to excavate and bring to attention political agency of the most marginalized. And that, along with the collective online process, which we worked very hard to build in what were very challenging pandemic times, I think means that there's a real coherence to the book overall. So together we pursue 4 sets of questions that, broadly speaking, map onto the 4 parts of the book. I mean, there is overlap between them, but broadly speaking, this is how the book works. So in the first part, the chapters focus on the question of how does gender intersect with other forms of power and identity to shape protest camps, and vice versa, actually. How is gender reshaped in camps? And the chapters in this part drill down into how and why gendered violence is a persistent problem in mixed camps. And they unpack how this problem is complicated by its intersection with other forms of inequality, particularly racism and particularly settler colonial violence. And these chapters also expose less brutal, but no less insidious hierarchies that structure who gets to speak in camps and who does what. And more positively, they show how feminists and allies might respond to these issues, and how protest camps can be sites of experimentation in gender identity and in gender expression. The chapters in the second part focus more on the question of what happens when feminists get involved in protest camps or when they set up their own. So the chapters in this part show a two-way influence, I think. They explore instances when feminists have successfully pushed back against gender hierarchies to imprint camps with feminist values and feminist language, and also how feminist movements can themselves be changed in their journey through camps. In the third part, the contributions ask, how can feminist theory help us rethink what protest camps are and what they might achieve? And here the chapters, including mine, draw on diverse Marxist, Black and anti-racist and Afro-Brazilian feminist literature to point to how the potential of camps can only be fully realized if we center the body, relations of care, and the role of marginalized political subjects, and if we confront what we argue are very serious, or I certainly argue in my chapter, serious structural limitations of the camp form within profoundly unequal societies. Finally, in part 4, this is perhaps the most, for me, stretched me as an editor, and I really like to thank my co-editor for her input into this part, because it's really, for me, quite fascinating, because this chapter asks, what are the legacies of protest camp involvement for contemporary feminism? And it does so through engagement with archival work. And here the chapters collectively point to some odd silences or misrepresentations in the stories that we tell about feminism. So past involvement in women-only camps is often misrepresented as just one thing, and a somewhat embarrassing thing at that by contemporary standards. Or it may be entirely erased because it disrupts neatly packaged narratives of feminism, which tell a story about mobilization in the 60s and then demobilization. While feminist involvement in more recent mixed camps is often missed because it requires us to understand how feminist mobilization today is often twined in and through other movements. So these chapters together argue for deeper feminist engagement with the archival traces of camps to help tell a more radical and complex story, not only of camps, but feminism. So in the end, then, the book actually casts a critical light on our understanding of feminism, as well as on protest camps. So I'm now moving in, I don't know what my timing's like, but I have, I think, 10 minutes, is that okay? This is the last part, you'll be pleased to know, and I'm going to try and draw out what all of this has to do with democracy. This is perhaps a bit broad brush, but I want to make 4 main points here, 2 negative and 2 positive. So firstly, it seems to me that protest camps can be seen as symptomatic of the absence or the crisis of democratic institutions. So whether we look at the Native American occupation of Alcatraz in 1969-71, or whether we look at the Aboriginal tent embassy outside in Canberra, established in 1972 originally, or whether we look at Greenham in the 1980s, you know, it's my view that people don't take to public spaces and seek to hold them for prolonged periods of time and build infrastructures within them, often in the face of serious violent state repression, unless they feel excluded from more conventional channels, that they can't get their voices heard, or that they feel those channels are so compromised that more drastic action needs to be taken. Also, in thinking about this negatively, I think protest camps can be sites of democratic disappointment or failure, where some voices and groups are systematically elevated over others, and those others are marginalized or even actively silenced. Conversely, though, protest camps are often an integral aspect of struggles to create and renew democratic institutions and also a broader democratic ethos. So this is most obvious in the global wave of activism, or the movement of squares, that Christina's written a lot about, where camps from 15M to Occupy to Gezi Park not only called into question the capacity of states to represent and mediate the interests of their citizens, but also demanded a whole panoply of democratic changes in their societies, as well as policy changes. And more than that, I think these camps sought to bring into being a kind of democratic spirit, you know. So Occupy sought not only to have policies that constrained bank independence, but also sought to argue for a polity that reflected the voices and interests of the so-called 99%. Moreover, protest camps can themselves be sites of democratic experimentation and possibility. The fact that they have a spatial form and that people live and organize collectively in them allows for experimentation with participatory or horizontal democratic modes of self-governance, however fleeting. And our contributor, Yeshim Arat, who tries to capture this in relation to the Gezi Park protest by drawing on Sheldon Wolin's notion of fugitive democracy. And she argues that the protesters at Gezi were, even for a short time, able to become political beings acting together to realize a new democratic vision. Yeah, we can perhaps talk a bit more about the kinds of participatory mechanisms developed in camps in our later discussion. But for now, I want to move on to what feminism might encourage us to think about in respect of this relationship between protest camps and democracy. So briefly, I think feminist analysis alerts us to how gender is a hierarchical relation of power, intersects with other hierarchies to constrain and deform participation in democratic institutions, just as it functions to constrain and deform democracy in protest camps. So I try and offer a way into this. I wasn't thinking about it in these terms, but it's kind of what I'm doing in my own chapter in the book, which explores how the gendered and racialized division of domestic labor in society and liberal democracies has functioned historically to limit the capacity of women, and particularly women of color, to exercise their full citizenship, and how this can be replicated in camps unless there is explicit work undertaken to overcome it. So the case studies that I mentioned, Faslane Peace Camp and Occupy Glasgow, offer very different lessons in relation to this, because Faslane Peace Camp, which is ostensibly an anti-nuclear camp, not an anti-capitalist one, although it is an anti-capitalist one as well, has, to varying degrees of success over the years, but it has sought to remake domestic and care labour, while Occupy Glasgow, which was explicitly, well, certainly critical of economic relations, if not anti-capitalist, did not pay attention to how domestic work was organised, and thus remained a site of exploitation and marginalisation, as well as of gender violence. So to give you another example, there's a chapter in the book by Chia-Ling Yang, which shows on Taiwan, which shows how informal, what we might call homosocial networks that exclude women from decision-making, and how gender stereotyping about appropriate roles for women and men worked not only to keep women in a subordinated position in Taiwanese democracy, but also to ensure they remain largely backstage in the 318 movement. And actually the photo I showed you earlier of the 318 movement is very evocative of that, because it literally has the men center stage, not women on the edge or behind. So that's another example of how gender works to limit democracy in that way. Conversely, the book also shows how feminism is crucial to democratic regeneration and a key source of democratic innovation and imagination in camps. So, for example, the chapter by Joan Haran entitled "Why the Compost Toilets?" explores the role of the eco-feminist writer and activist Starhawk in various encampments over the decades. And Joan's chapter ultimately argues that eco-feminist attentiveness to both spiritual bonds and to taking care of the shit, really, I can't put it any other way, indicates how we might organize ourselves in ways that are more effectively meet the needs of both humans and nature. So that's one example. And another example is Yashim's chapter on the Gezi Park protest, which I've already referred. She argues in that chapter how feminist organizing over the years in Turkey has actually pioneered many of the tactics that characterized Gezi. The creative use of domestic implements in political protest, the taking back of public space for women, the challenging of derogatory sexualized swear words in political discourse, the development of mechanisms to mediate quite fundamental differences between different groups of people. Yeah, she says this is a key part of the fugitive democracy that Gezi held out as a model to Turkish society. And actually, she argues that feminism was the source of many of these innovations. So I want to close by highlighting the two chapters that I think do deal most exhaustively or most clearly with the relationship of camps to democracy. So I think, you know, it's not an organizing theme of the book, but in fact, when I think about it in these terms, it kind of, those two arguments that I've just made thread through the book. But there's two theoretical chapters, one by Sarah Motter and her colleagues, which uses Afro-Brazilian feminist theorizing to make sense of collective organizing by women of color in northeastern Brazil, particularly women within the squatters camps connected with the Movimento Sem Terra, the landless movement. And they also look at women's slam poetry collectives. And they're trying to look at how these women have organized as women in order to take up space and to occupy particular kinds of political subjectivities. And I see this language actually as pushing at the limits of the language and practices of liberal democracy, as well as of protest camps, by showing how it's possible to transform, or in the author's terms, to feminize ways of speaking and of living politically in order to ensure the flourishing of both body and land. And the top two pictures there are from the landless movement in Brazil. This chapter, I think, offers us an alternative grammar of the political, one centering on healing and liberation. So they don't frame it in terms of democracy, but in effect, they're arguing for a very different understanding of what democracy is or could be. The second chapter that I want to draw attention to is by Anastasia Cavada. And this chapter operates within a political grammar that's more familiar to those of us, many of us here, I'm sure, in that it surveys examples of movement practices in the encampments and movement of squares in Europe, in particular in 2011 and beyond, and it brings them into dialogue with US and European feminist theorizing of democracy, prominent thinkers such as Carol Pateman, Joan Tronto, and Silvia Federici. And briefly, Anastasia argues that feminist thinking helps us make sense of disparate camp practices as part of a kind of project democracy, whereby activists create democratic modes of engagement with each other in order to get stuff done. For Cavada, the feminist significance of these practices lies in how they politicize social reproduction in order to meet people's basic needs, how they center a caring ethic and relationships of care between each other and the most vulnerable in society, and how they problematize the public-private divide and the primacy of private property in liberal societies, and instead insist that citizens are interdependent and must share in the commons. So she concludes that feminism not only helps us see what camps can achieve democratically, but also offers, and I quote, a set of normative criteria on which we can judge the performance of democratic systems. Do they center people's vulnerability and dependence? Do they take care of their citizens' physical and emotional needs? Do they consider caring activities as part of citizens' democratic duties? Do they assume that citizens should be involved in processes of communal sharing of resources? And I think the answer is often no. So for Anastasia, then, feminism is a lens that helps us evaluate not only project democracy and protest camps, but also liberal democracy more broadly. And it provides essential tools for social movements in the struggle to build a more deeply democratic society. So I'll stop there. And if you'd like to read these chapters and others, please buy the book or get your library to buy it. Thank you very much for your attention online and in the room. And I'll stop there and take some questions.